Today, I will tell you a story, one that was never meant to be spoken aloud. It is said to come from a scroll hidden beneath centuries of dust, a record of truths too heavy for the living to carry. So listen carefully, for this is not myth. It is memory. Before Eden ever opened its gates, before the breath entered Adam's lungs, the heavens carried a wound that no star could hide. The scribes of the Second Temple wrote of it in fragments, a shape seen only in the corner of a prophet's weakened vision, a presence felt, not walked. They said the adversary was not a serpent, nor any creature of the earth, but a radiance twisted into its own shadow, a being once woven of pure light, now fractured, refracted, broken into angles the human mind could not hold. In the oldest Aramaic texts, the ones sealed because they troubled the priests, the adversary is called Sar-ha-Mishpath, the prince of the boundary, not a tempter, not yet an enemy, a watcher placed between the divine command and the freedom of the first souls. Neither angel nor beast, but something in the space between. When the prophets described him, their hands trembled. No ink could shape the form they claimed to see. Not wings, not scales, not flesh. Only a silhouette cut from light itself, standing where light should not be. The kind of form a man might glimpse only in the last heartbeat before fainting. He walked the heavens in silence. He obeyed without warmth. He observed humanity before humanity existed. And when Eden opened, he descended not as a serpent, nor as any earthly form, but as a voice without a body, an idea wearing a shimmer of light. The serpent was merely the mask, the shadow on the cave wall, the echo of something older, deeper, and far more terrible. The scroll says, he did not crawl, he shone. And that is where the story begins, with a creature of light, not scales, the first being to stand against the will that shaped the world. The scroll continues in lines worn thin by time, each word carved with the urgency of a scribe who feared what he recorded. It tells of the moment when heaven first learned that obedience without love becomes rebellion without warning. The adversary had not yet fallen. No thunder, no war, no angels cast from the heights. Only a quiet divergence, like a single star drifting from its constellation. In those early ages he stood near the throne, where the radiance was brighter than creation itself. His form was still beautiful then, too beautiful. The chroniclers said his light bent the light around him, as though he existed half a breath out of place. While other angels bowed, he watched. While they sang, he listened, always listening. The divine command was simple: guard the boundary. Let no corruption pass from realm to realm. But the boundary itself haunted him, because to guard a thing is to question it, and to question a thing is to hunger for the answer. In the sealed writings of Antioch, a rare commentary survives. The adversary was the first to feel the silence of God. It did not frighten him at first. It fascinated him. The silence pressed against him like an unanswered prayer, a space where something might be hidden, a secret, a truth withheld. And where there is something withheld, there is the birth of longing. It was this silence, not pride, that opened the first fracture in him. The scroll describes his descent not as a fall, but as a turning away, a subtle shift, like a beam of light redirected through a shard of crystal. His radiance no longer aligned with the heavens. It refracted into forms unrecognizable, even to those who once called him brother. Something changed in his eyes. not in their brightness, but in their depth. As if he began to see the world from the other side of the veil, where shadows had their own light and truth had its own double. And when humanity rose from dust and breath, he looked upon them not with hatred nor envy, but with a strange, cold curiosity. For he understood what they did not, that the silence of God could become a question, and a question could become a doorway. A doorway he would soon step through. The ancient scroll shifts in tone here. The scribe's strokes grow narrower, as if he feared the memory he was recording. He writes that when the adversary first approached the newborn world, the earth itself recoiled, not from evil, for evil had no name yet, but from the weight of a being that did not belong to soil or a sky. He crossed the boundary as a ripple of radiance, a distortion in the air, like heat rising from stone, yet untouched by fire. No serpent slithered, no wings opened, no footsteps marked the dust, only a presence, silent, observing, calculating the fragile breath of creatures newly formed. Adam knew nothing of him. Eve sensed something, but only as a distant hum, a pressure behind her heartbeat. The adversary moved as light moves, invisible until it strikes an object and reveals itself. What he saw in humanity unsettled him, for they carried something he did not, the likeness, not the glory of heaven, not the power of angels, but something far more dangerous, the image of the one whose silence he could no longer bear. The scroll says he circled Eden's edge, not out of spite, but out of hunger, the hunger for understanding. Why had these fragile beings been granted what he had guarded for ages yet never possessed? Why give dust the mystery of choice? He traced the garden's borders, his form flickering between brilliance and shadow. Animals sensed him and fled. The trees bent away from him without wind. Even the river darkened in his passing, as if his presence drank the color from its waters. When the voice walked in the garden, all creation bowed, all except one. The adversary stood still, unbent, untouched by the divine breeze. For the first time, the heavens and the earth witnessed a creature who did not move in reverence. This was not rebellion, not yet. This was recognition, the realization that he was no longer in harmony with the realm he once served. And so he sought a way to speak, to enter the world, without revealing the terrifying shape he had become. A form too radiant for mortals, too fractured for angels. He found it in the serpent, not as a disguise of deception, but as a vessel, a shadow small enough to carry a voice that no human ear was meant to hear. Thus the serpent became the mirror. The adversary remained the light behind it. And when the moment came, he did not tempt Eve with wickedness. He tempted her with curiosity, the very spark that had undone him. The scroll deepens here, as though the scribe paused before writing, as if the truth itself pressed against his chest. He begins this section with a warning: do not mistake the whisper for the one who spoke it. The serpent's mouth moved, yes. Its tongue flickered, yes. But the voice that touched Eve's mind was not the voice of any creature that crawls. It was older than dawn, colder than judgment, sharper than truth itself. The adversary did not speak in words, not at first. He spoke in impressions, like the echo of a thought just out of reach, a shimmer behind the eyes. Eve felt the question before she heard it. It brushed her mind the way moonlight brushes water, shaping ripples without touching the surface. Why are you not permitted to know? Not a challenge, not defiance, a question, the same question that once turned an angel sideways within heaven's light. The serpent coiled nearby, unaware of what moved through it. The garden shimmered around her. Leaves stood still. Even the wind held its breath. For when the adversary focused his gaze, creation itself tightened like a drum skin. The scroll says, "His light entered the serpent as a man enters a doorway, not to become it, but to lean through it." Eve saw only an animal, but something unseen bent the space behind it. And what did he offer her? Not rebellion, not sin, but the same thing he had once reached for in heaven, understanding. He asked her to consider why a perfect God would place a boundary in a perfect paradise. He asked her to imagine what lay beyond the silence she had never questioned. Eve did not fall. Eve reached. She reached just as he had reached ages before her, because the adversary knew something she did not. A forbidden thing becomes irresistible the moment you wonder why it is forbidden. When she looked at the tree, she did not see a command. She saw a possibility. And when she listened to the voice behind the serpent, she did not hear a deceiver. She heard the echo of her own unspoken curiosity. The scroll ends this part with a single chilling line. Thus, the first sin was not disobedience. It was reflection. This portion of the scroll bears scorch marks, as if the scribe wrote something that frightened even him. The ink turns darker, the letters narrower, and a faint note in the margin warns, "He who reads this must steady his spirit." For here the chronicler reveals what the early priests refused to teach, that when Eve reached for the fruit, she was not merely breaking a command. She was stepping into a space the adversary had opened, a space between obedience and understanding, a space he himself had once crossed. The moment her fingers touched the fruit, the world did not shatter. The skies did not roar. No thunder shook Eden. Instead, something quieter happened, something far more dangerous. A light flickered, not from the tree, from her, the scroll records. For an instant shorter than breath, the adversary saw in humanity what he once saw in himself, the spark of a will that moves even when heaven is silent. It was this moment, not the bite, that bound their destinies. The adversary did not rejoice. He did not triumph. He stared, for Eve had done what he himself had done ages before. She questioned the boundary, and in that act, something terrible and beautiful awakened, the human capacity to stand before God not only in worship, but in wonder. The serpent slithered away, its task completed without knowing it, but the presence behind it lingered, shimmering like heat over stone. Eve felt it, not as fear, but as awareness, a pressure, a brightness, a presence that was not God yet not entirely separate from his throne. She did not see the adversary's true form, for no mortal could, but she sensed the curvature of something vast, luminous, fractured. And in that instant, the adversary made his first mistake. He wondered if these creatures of dust, with their fragile breath and trembling hands, could walk a path he could not, if they could bear the knowledge that shattered him, if they could hold the weight of truth without fracturing into shadow. For a moment, almost imperceptible, he hesitated, and in that hesitation the heavens changed. A tremor passed through Eden. The light shifted. The silence of God deepened, not like absence, but like the drawing of a bowstring. The adversary felt it first, judgment, not a word. not a gesture, a coming. He withdrew from the serpent's shadow, his form collapsing into brilliance and fracture. Eve heard nothing but the sudden rustle of leaves. Yet, somewhere just beyond the veil of sight, a being of light recoiled, not from guilt, but from recognition. For he understood what was about to happen. The one who had been silent was about to speak. The scroll's parchment grows uneven here, as though the hand that wrote it shook. This section feels heavier, denser. The scribe describes not an event, but a collision between realms. He writes, "When the voice entered the garden, creation remembered its maker. It began with a sound too soft to be thunder, too deep to be footsteps. A vibration, the kind that moves through the bones before the ears. Animals froze, leaves tilted. The river stilled as if awaiting its own judgment. But the adversary felt it like fire, not burning him, revealing him. The light that had once been his garment recoiled. The fractures that shaped his new form shuddered as the presence approached. He withdrew from the edges of Eden, trying to fold himself back into the unseen places between worlds. But one cannot hide from the voice that called the cosmos into being. And the chronicler writes that this was the first time the adversary knew fear, not of punishment, not of death, for angels do not die. He feared being seen. For when the voice walked among the trees, nothing could remain what it pretended to be. Eve stood trembling, not from guilt, but from a sudden clarity, as if the light around her had shifted to expose something within her soul. Adam felt it too, the trembling of a world about to split, and the adversary, who once walked in the courts of fire, now stood in the shadow of the Creator's approach, feeling his own radiance twist inward like a star collapsing. The scroll whispers, "The serpent fled, but the light behind it could not flee." The voice called, "Where are you?" Not to find Adam, to reveal Adam to himself. But the adversary heard something deeper, an echo meant not for humanity, but for him. A question that pierced his being. Where are you? For he was no longer where he once had been, neither in heaven nor in obedience. He had stepped beyond the boundary he was commanded to guard. It was then he understood this was not a confrontation. This was a separation. The adversary retreated further, folding his fractured light like wings he no longer possessed. But the scroll says that for a moment, just one, God looked upon him. No words, no accusation, only sight. And that sight did what no war in heaven could have done. It defined him, not as a guardian, not as a watcher, but as the adversary. His purpose inverted, his light hardened, his role sealed. In that moment, something far worse than exile occurred. Identity. And the scroll marks this line with a stroke so heavy it tore the parchment. Thus he became what he could not endure, and could not endure what he had become. Eden was no longer a garden. It was a courtroom, and the next judgment would not fall upon the serpent, but upon the being that had spoken through its shadow. The scroll's 7th section is the most difficult to read. The ink smudged, the parchment cracked, as if the truth written here resisted being preserved. The scribe begins with a solemn phrase. Here ends the age of innocence, not for man alone, but for the one who questioned the silence. Judgment moved through Eden like a wind that carried no breath. Leaves shivered without sound. The sky dimmed without clouds. Every living thing bowed as if remembering an ancient fear buried within its design. But the adversary did not bow. He could not. For the moment, God looked upon him. The nature he once carried willingly became a burden far heavier than chains. His fractured radiance pulsed like a star straining against its own gravity, each shard of light a reminder of the truth he had stepped into. He had crossed the boundary he was sworn to guard. God spoke to the serpent first, the vessel, not the voice. The creature trembled, its body twisting as the curse fell upon it, like dust turned to stone. But beneath the judgment, the adversary felt the words pierce him. Cursed are you. Upon your belly you shall go. Dust you shall eat. These words were not meant for his nature, but they reverberated within him like an inverted echo. The curse was not his fate, yet something deeper was. The scroll says, the curse bound the creature, but the gaze bound the one behind it. Then God spoke to the woman and to the man, words recorded, taught, understood for generations. But hidden between those pronouncements was a silence addressed only to the adversary, a silence heavier than speech. And in that silence he understood something terrifying. Humanity would now bleed. Humanity would now die. Humanity would now fear. Yet humanity would also seek, reach, question, just as he had. The adversary saw the path ahead, not in details, but in essence. Humanity, cast from a perfect garden, would walk through shadows, searching for light. And because he had tasted the danger of divine silence, he knew how to twist that silence into despair. This was no victory. It was a revelation. The scroll records that he withdrew from Eden not in triumph, but in dread, shrinking into the unseen spaces between realms, his fractured light dimming as he fled. He left the garden the way a shadow retreats from dawn, not destroyed, but diminished. For he understood the judgment not spoken aloud. He would never again stand in the place where light is whole. He would forever exist only where it breaks. And so the adversary departed, not fallen yet, but unbound from heaven. A being without home, without rest, without the harmony he once knew. A wanderer in creation, a fracture in the divine order, a question turned into form, and humanity, newly burdened, stepped onto the earth. He would soon walk beside them. The scroll's 8th section is written in a hand noticeably older, as though years passed before the scribe dared continue. The parchment shifts from smooth to brittle, and a faint note in the margin reads, "What follows is the knowledge that drove 3 archivists to seal this record." For here, the chronicler describes the true beginning of the adversary's fall. Not the moment in Eden, but what came after, when he entered a world no longer guarded by innocence. He moved across the wasteland outside the garden in a form that was not a form. A brightness dimmed, a shadow with memory, a being of angles where no angles should exist. Animals sensed him first. They lowered their heads and refused to look. The ground around him cracked, not from heat, but from tension, as though creation strained to hold a presence that did not belong. The scroll says, he walked as a fracture walks, silently, spreading. It was not hatred that filled him. It was not vengeance. It was disorientation. For the first time since his making, he was unmoored, unassigned, unanchored. He had been the guardian of the threshold. Now he had become the thing that existed between thresholds, a wanderer of boundaries that no longer welcomed him. He searched for the voice he once served. He found only distance. He searched for light he once carried. He found only the echoes of what had been. And in his searching, he encountered humanity, no longer clothed in Eden's radiance, but trembling, ashamed, adjusting to the roughness of dust beneath their feet. He watched them build their first fire. He watched them shiver under the first night. He watched them bleed from thorns and struggle against hunger. And something unimaginable stirred within him. Recognition. The adversary had known exile in heaven. Humanity now knew exile on earth. They were as strangers in their own existence, just as he was now a stranger in creation. And in that mirrored suffering, a dark seed took root. Not compassion, not love, but alignment. For he realized something the humans could not yet grasp. A wounded creature listens differently. The silence of God that once tormented him now tormented them. Their questions echoed his own ancient questions. Their fear mirrored his own. Their isolation deepened the chasm he had first discovered in the heavens. And in that shared emptiness, he found opportunity. Not to corrupt, to influence, not to destroy, to shape. The chronicler writes, he did not tempt them first, he learned them first. He studied their tears, their doubts, their dreams, their longings for what was lost. And in these fragile pieces of humanity, he discovered something more dangerous than rebellion. A void that could be filled. The adversary realized that humanity would seek answers, and he could offer questions that felt like truths. Thus the true war began, not with swords, not with thunder, but with interpretation. For if heaven offered commandments, the adversary would offer meaning. If heaven offered law, he would offer reasoning. If heaven remained silent, he would speak into that silence. Not with lies, but with reflections. Reflections that bend the light just enough to change its path. The 9th section feels like the heart of the scroll, the place where the scribe finally writes what earlier generations refused to hear. The edges are burned, and the ink sinks deep into the fibers as if etched by trembling hands. At the top of the page, a warning appears. Here is the unveiling of the adversary's true form, not in appearance, but in function. For the chronicler reveals that the fall of the adversary was not a single moment, but a gradual descent, shaped not by wrath, but by reflection, the same reflection that awakened Eve's curiosity. As humanity began to multiply, to build, to mourn, to dream, the adversary wandered between them like a shadow cast by a flame no one could see. He did not come as a monster. He did not come as a serpent. He did not come as a winged terror. He came as a counterpoint. Where heaven offered revelation, he offered interpretation. Where heaven offered instruction, he offered perspective. Where heaven offered silence, he offered meaning, the scroll records. He spoke in the spaces between words, in the hesitation before obedience, in the ache beneath prayer. Humanity did not recognize him, for they expected a creature of scales, a horned beast, a towering apparition. But the adversary's true form, the scribe insists, cannot be represented in flesh or ink. He is the distortion of light, the fracture in understanding, the angle in thought that shifts truth by a single degree. Not a lie, a bending, not a deception, a reframing. For no creature willingly swallows a lie, but a truth slightly altered becomes irresistible. The chronicler writes that the adversary discovered this not through malice, but through observation. When he whispered to humanity, He whispered questions he himself once asked. Why is this forbidden? What lies beyond the boundary? Why does the Almighty remain silent? What if knowledge is another kind of worship? These questions spread like fire through dry grass, quiet at first, then consuming, reshaping human thought. And because the adversary himself had been undone by such reflections, he knew exactly where to place them within the human spirit. The scroll continues. He became the voice behind uncertainty, the shimmer behind desire, the shadow behind revelation. Not as a tyrant, as an influence, not forcing rebellion, guiding it gently. For rebellion born from rage is easy to quench, but rebellion born from curiosity becomes doctrine. Over generations, the adversary moved like an unseen current through the rising cities of men. Temples shifted, beliefs diverged, prophets wrestled with visions that felt too heavy to bear. And still he remained unseen, for his form was not one the eyes could witness. His form was function. The scribe ends this section with a line that seems almost too heavy for mortal ears. The adversary does not appear, he occurs. And as humanity grew in wisdom, in wandering, in yearning for meaning, the final act of his fall approached. Not a collapse, but a coronation. A moment when the adversary would finally become what heaven had seen in Eden's shadow. The final section of the scroll is unlike the others. The letters are carved, not written, gouged into the surface as if the scribe feared the truth might escape if merely inked. A faint dust of stone still clings to the edges. At the top, a final warning. He who reads this part walks on the boundary he once guarded. For here, the chronicler reveals not how the adversary fell, but what he became. According to the last surviving lineages of temple scholars, the adversary's fall was not a plummet into fire. It was a crowning, not a throne of glory, a throne of consequence. For when humanity left Eden carrying the weight of their new awareness, the heavens shifted. God did not create a new enemy. He allowed the one who questioned the silence to become its keeper. The scroll reads, "The adversary was appointed to rule the realm where light fractures into choice. Not heaven, not earth. Something in between, the domain of wandering thoughts, wayward desires, whispered doubts, a realm shaped not of stone or flame, but of interpretation, the place where every human soul wrestles with its own shadows. And in that realm, his form finally became fixed, not serpentine, not monstrous, not winged, but angular, radiant, broken, a being of light refracted into 1,000 shards, each shard touching a different corner of the human mind. The chronicler writes, "He does not tempt the righteous, he questions them. He does not lie to the seeker, he reframes what is found. He does not oppose by force, he opposes by offering meaning." This was the coronation heaven allowed. The adversary became the prince of nuance, the lord of almost truth, the ruler of the realm where doubt is born. And this, the scroll warns, is why he was never a serpent, never merely a creature of earth's dust. A serpent is small, simple, visible, but the adversary's true form is something far more ancient and far more dangerous. He is the fracture in understanding, the bending of light, the shape of a question standing where certainty once stood. Not a beast, not an angel, not a monster. A mirror, reflecting not what is, but what could be if tilted 1 degree. And the scribe ends with the last surviving words of the forbidden chronicle. As long as mankind seeks meaning, he will have dominion. For his kingdom is not fire, It is the moment between truth and interpretation. And then, in a final stroke, carved deeper than all the rest, his true form is not seen. His true form is experienced. This is the end of the scroll, and the beginning of every question that has ever troubled the human soul.